Hi, not that line, the other line. Andrew, and this is Gayties Toys. On today's MIA 80s Ladies, we're going to be talking about, one of my favorite shows, two of my favorite characters ever. And, an episode that I'd wanted to do, pretty much since the inception of MIA 80s Ladies, but I kind of just didn't get around to it. And also, I was kind of, trying to keep myself from just talking about it too much. So the real ticking time bomb is going on right now because this thing is very hot. So let's just get right into Star Trek The Next Generation's Counselor Troi and Dr. Crusher. If you don't know what a Star Trek is, I don't know how you got this far in life without. I don't know who hurt you, but in any case, as a refresher, Star Trek, the original series anyway, was created by Gene Roddenberry and ran from 1966 until 1969. It is, let's say, notorious for ham-fisted acting, for cheesy, bad special effects, but really, at the core of it, was sort of, scathing social commentary under all these sort of campier elements. It was really sort of commenting on human nature at the time, but also the potential for what humans could be in the future. NBC didn't really know what they had at the time. They didn't have proper ways to measure ratings the way we do now. So they kind of kept thinking this was, just a terrible show, and they could not wait to cancel it. And the fans had sort of, brought it back from the brink of cancellation a couple times, but eventually it was canceled. And eventually would sort of just go off and be, its own thing in the zeitgeist. Star Trek conventions started to crop up really quickly and really expanded across North America and the rest of the world. Gene Roddenberry himself eventually would start to attend these and get a little, let's say high in his own supply during these things. There would be a spin-off series called The Animated Series, which, as you can tell, was an animated series in the 70s. However, when Star Wars hit, it goes without saying, it changed everything. And Paramount took a look around the room and said, do we got a Star Wars? And in fact, they did. So they pretty much initially thought to do a television spin-off, which Roddenberry had been, of course, campaigning for a long time. This one would be called Star Trek Phase 2. And would essentially bring back most of the original cast, plus a few new characters. Two of the more important characters here would be sort of a sex-crazed, hot alien chick named Lieutenant Ilia, and the new executive officer would be like a strapping, handsome human man. And they would have a forbidden love from years past and now had to meet back up on this ship and, sort of keep things professional, but horny. These two characters specifically put a pin in that. The show was scrapped pretty quickly, but Paramount decided to, really sort of, go head-to-head against Star Wars and, greenlit Star Trek The Motion Picture. Again, reuniting the entire cast, and again, including Lieutenant Ilia and Commander Decker, who were hot and horny, but had to keep things professional because they're on a quasi-military ship. The Star Trek The Motionless Picture was bad. It was boring. This is not a hot take, but it made a lot of money. So Paramount said, okay, we're gonna, just keep going with these. And it really wasn't until, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, which was a sort of, fan, audience, and critical darling, that they said, okay, now's the time to return to television. And they, reluctantly went back to Gene Roddenberry, who's, really kind of owned Star Trek, essentially, to go and create the next generation of Star Trek movies and shows. Star Trek The Next Generation would sort of begin development around 1986, and around that time they also said, to coincide with the launch of the show, we would like action figures to go with this. Galoob Toys was the one who eventually won the license to do so, and they were very much on hand during early development. This is kind of a good and bad thing. They would have the time needed to produce a toy and have it on toy shelves. However, they would really, at the ground floor, they sort of didn't really have ratings, hindsight, anything of the sort to actually know which characters would be popular, what ships would be popular, what storylines would be. Like, frankly, they only had a handful of scripts plus the pilot movie, so they were like going in a little blind, to be honest. Nevertheless, Star Trek The Next Generation chugged along, and eventually it aired in 1987 and would run for 7 seasons until 1994. The first 2 seasons, which we'll get to, hot mess, but the quality picks up immediately in season 3. So if you're going to do a rewatch, do a lot of skipping for the first 2 seasons, like most Star Trek at the time, frankly. In relation to Star Trek, in relation to the Galoob toy line that was going to launch with the show, in relation to MIA 80s Ladies, we're going to talk about 2 characters today. And of course, I'm going to start with one of my favorites ever, and that would be Ship's Counselor, Lieutenant Commander Deanna Troi. She was, sort of born of a human male Starfleet officer and a kind of almost aristocratic, very eccentric Betazoid woman. The Betazoids were telepathic race of species who looked very human except for very, very dark eyes. So essentially, Deanna was born mostly empathic, which I've talked about many a time in this series. It's just such a chick power, but she had some empathy. She could sort of sense danger, presences if someone was lying. Useful in theory. Roddenberry's take on the character during the early development, however, was, classic Roddenberry and sort of, little hints of gross. So she really was kind of two ends of a pendulum here. So on one side, she would have been a three-breasted ditz, just a complete airhead. On the other side, he wanted, the mental health officer on the bridge to have quite a bit of power. So she would have been the second officer instead of Data. She would have, properly been in the command ring on the bridge as part of that command structure. She would have been always the smartest person in the room. And what we got was sort of a mix of the two in the end. The first season, Troi, admittedly not bad. She had, very honest, intelligent things to say. She was very alien, very other. She had exotic hairdos. Her customs from her home planet were really weird and sort of, odd by human Starfleet standards. And there's a good genesis there, but, as Marina Sirtis, the actress who played Deanna Troi, would say, as her line would go down to show more cleavage, her brains would likewise fall. So it really was many, many seasons of hers just being a decorative plant on the bridge with just huge tits and, stating the obvious. He's lying. We're in danger. We know. Everyone knows. Anyone with eyes can tell, Deanna. It wouldn't be until season 6 when she would start to wear a uniform again and become a commander. She would raise in rank and raise in importance on the bridge. Likewise, as the uniform came back, so too did her brains. While, there wasn't a lot to her character, one of the big conceits that Roddenberry had also envisioned was, again, the Ilia and Decker factor, where Commander Riker and Counselor Troi had, a torrid love affair in their wild and crazy youth, and then he abruptly left her to pursue his career, and she continued on in her, psychology degree. So they would eventually come back together, rather surprisingly to Will at the very least, and, would serve together on the Enterprise. And their will they, won't they would become, a very looming, sort of character traits of the two of them throughout the show and well into their 4 movies until finally culminating in their wedding in the very not good Star Trek Nemesis. The other underused, but probably a little better in the character development, character would be Dr. Beverly Crusher. She was the chief medical officer, a commander, same as Will Riker. Very, very kind of tough character. She was someone who usually was sort of shunted off to sickbay, so you didn't see her a lot, but, Gates McFadden, the actress who played her, really, wanted more. I mean, they both did, frankly, but I mean, Gates McFadden was given a little more to do as, sort of the head doctor and someone, who had sort of extra military command powers where, the health and safety of the crew was paramount, and her orders in that regard trumped even the captain. She could, relieve him of duty if need be. So, cool little concept there. Even cooler is that she actually knew the captain way, way, way before she ever served on the Enterprise with him. So she was Beverly Howard and met her future husband Jack, who was Captain Picard's best friend. And it was under Picard's command that Beverly's husband had died. So, she carried on with their child, single mom, and would not meet up with Picard until years later when she served under him again as his chief medical officer. And there certainly was some sexual tension between the two of them, and it wasn't so much a will they, won't they as hard as it was with, Deanna and Riker, but certainly, there was great chemistry, and it really, was a through line throughout the show. Everyone kind of saw Dr. Crusher as the final girl for Picard. It kind of was. Crusher fared better in, sort of characterization, in the sense that, her real responsibility was the medical care of the crew. And so when she had to brush up against protocol, against regulations from Starfleet, she really, bristled against it. So, something might be technically, legally correct, but it wasn't morally correct. And she would be the first one to jump in that fight, and sometimes very much alone. But she was the character who was the first to go to her old friend, but also her commanding officer, and say, this is wrong, you need to know it, and I don't care what the rules say, but you need to get into action, or I will. And that sort of, real kind of like aggressive energy, and that one character who could actually stand up to, the godfather of the whole ship, was really interesting. Really sort of, gave her a lot more oomph than poor Troi. I could have rambled longer, but I'm choosing not to. Very hot. So Galoob Toys was the one who were making action figures and playsets and vehicles for Star Trek: The Next Generation as it launched. They had access to the bridge, the sets, the costumes, the actors. They had photos of everything, and they had all that to bring back to Galoob Studios and produce something for the launch of the show. There's a great interview on TrekCore that I'll list below, and I've spoken to them, and they've sort of allowed me to share some bits from the interview as well as some photos, which is very, very much appreciated. But that interview with a bunch of Galoob employees it's the gold standard on this line of toys. In it, they showed sort of their early concepts, their kind of reasoning for doing things. Like a lot of the aliens they chose were from, again, those very, very early episodes. They chose pretty much the entire crew except Troi and Crusher. They did concede that, they did look at the security chief, Tasha Yar, would be a action style, figure, like an action-y type of character. And so they did include her, at the very least, in Wave 1. However, the actress who played Tasha Yar was wrong about how action-y she would be. Galoob was wrong about how action-y we were all wrong about how action-y Tasha Yar would be, and the actress did, beg to get out of her contract very early in season 1, so the character was killed off rather unceremoniously. In the interview with TrekCore, they also showed, sort of potential playsets they would do. A lot of sort of, enterprise-shaped playsets, let's say. They were very kind of juicy and big on the top, like a big burger, but like really, really incredible stuff. I love their sort of, their bridge, how they would try to incorporate a lot of different areas of the ship into this one big hamburger bun of a saucer on Star Trek, Starship Enterprise. So really interesting stuff there. But in there, they also did concede that, they did not really want to make Troi or Crusher, at least initially. They very much bought into the, female figures don't sell kind of trope of the time, which, look, I don't have the sales number. It might be, the case, but less so now. If you want my real thoughts on the matter, go back to my very first video. In any case, they did also say that, had the line succeeded, had it, just kept going, of course they would have made Troi and Crusher. However, that does sort of pose a bit of a thought experiment, all of its own. Had Galoob Toys' Star Trek line succeeded, there's a few what-ifs here. So, Deanna Troi, at the end of the day, was the only female character to go from front to back of the series. And she went through many, many looks. So if they had gotten to her, they likely would have gone with her season 2 look, where she had sort of a burgundy, big booby jumpsuit and, like a much longer hair than we saw in season 1. So, that's sort of my guess, based off of how long it takes to make television shows and how long, it takes to make toys. So I would guess they would probably go that route versus the season 1 route. Dr. Crusher's a whole different animal, because again, like the actress who played Tasha Yar, Denise Crosby, Gates McFadden had a huge problem with the producers of season 1. There's a reason why people say to skip season 1 and 2, because it's bad, because there was drama behind the scenes. So Gates McFadden actually left for all of season 2. So if Galoob were to do Dr. Crusher, they might not, because they didn't know that she was coming back, and come back she did. When we talk about how the quality jumps up in season 3 going forward, a large part of that is because Gates McFadden was, essentially convinced to come back by Patrick Stewart. Nevertheless, the, fan reaction was not good for season 1 of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And likewise, the adult collectible kind of market wasn't quite there. So, it was a matter of like, who were these toys for, really? So, sales tanked, ratings tanked. The whole thing just went kablooey pretty quickly. However, things were about to change for the better. While the Galoob line failed and sort of clogged pegs for years afterwards, Star Trek figures were not quite done, not by a long shot. So the next one to pick up the baton was Playmates toys, hot off their success of Ninja Turtles. So they sort of took this license in with cash to burn. They had nothing to lose here. So I've talked about, Playmates Star Trek many a times in this series, because they did it right. I'm surprised I even have to talk about this, but they went from, say, 1994 until pretty much the end of the century, around 1998, 1999. They made Star Trek figures, and they made as many as humanly possible. Starting, of course, with Star Trek: The Next Generation, which was going on, it was probably about midway through its run at that point. So they really did have the hindsight, the episode counts, the character beats. They knew what had happened. They, certainly saw success moving forward. So they really did hit the ground running with, a great assortment of characters in the first wave, including Counselor Troi, now in her, I would say, not the costume she wore the most, but certainly her most iconic, with sort of the gray and pink kind of jumpsuit. Very, again, boobtastic. Again, Dr. Crusher seemed to have been shut out, but by wave 2, which was a much larger and more expansive wave the following year, we would have Dr. Crusher, we would have Whoopi Goldberg's Guinan, we would have Worf's, I don't know, wife-ish, girlfriend character, Kayla. I mean, and they would just keep going. We would have another Tasha Yar. We would have Tasha's alternate future reality daughter, the Romulan Sela. We had so many. Playmates did everything right, and they sort of, would continue this well into, when Star Trek Deep Space Nine launched, when Voyager launched. They, very much were the best Star Trek line ever, frankly. Since we're here, and I'm probably not going to do a separate video specifically for that, I mean, Playmates toys, they went pretty hard for a pretty long time, but they, of course, they didn't get to everybody, so there were a few characters, I would say particularly from Deep Space Nine, that they did not get to, and I would say, the real standouts for me would be, Ensign Ezri Dax, would be Kai Wynn, would be Captain Cassidy Yates. There's certain big characters, particularly late in Deep Space Nine's run, that I think, we're really missing. Nevertheless, if you've got your own that think, Playmates should have done, sound off below. The only other company that came as close to Playmates, as Playmates, as large as Playmates would have been Diamond Select. Technically, Art Asylum started off in 2001 with the Star Trek license and would eventually be gobbled up by Diamond Select. But they started with the series Star Trek Enterprise, but would branch out and do, at the very least, Next Generation, Wrath of Khan, original series, and, Deep Space Nine characters. They really could have gone further. And the sculpts really are good. The sculpts actually hold up. The character selection's spectacular. The plastic, not great. Don't recommend. However, for Next Generation, they really kind of wisely did, a series of looks. Each wave would have maybe 2 characters, but sort of 3 important looks. And so in the case of, say, Troi or Crusher, we got to see them in regular Starfleet, and Troi had 2 of her jumpsuit looks. We had sort of All Good Things Crusher. We had certainly a lot of options there. So I mean, they did not cheap out when it came to the ladies. They did skip on Tasha though. Beyond Diamond Select and of course Playmates, most other toy lines that pick up the Star Trek license very much fall into the Galoob trap, where they have sort of big lofty ideals and then it kind of shits the bed in the end. So we've seen this from Super 7, we've seen this from McFarlane Toys. This happens over and over and over again. However, currently, time of recording, Nacelle Toys, who I've said on camera many times, sort of like the new Super 7, where they take the obscure, the weird, and take it to market and seemingly do pretty good at it. They got the Star Trek license. At the very least, the license, where we're talking about. We're talking like, original series movies up until around like, early 2000s, including Star Trek Enterprise. So, I mean, really my sweet spot. So they're making figures based off of that. Their first 2 waves were, I think admittedly, and I think, they intentionally, wackadoo characters. I mean, just, mostly figures and characters we've never seen before in plastic. So a great take. Very, really great to see characters that have never been made before finally, come to light. However, if you have these characters but not the actual main cast, what are you supposed to do with these? So Nacelle did pivot and said, look, Wave 3, we're going to do the original series crew. You're going to get a whole bridge crew all in one go. They'll probably do another wackadoo wave after that, and then after that, I would guess either next gen or perhaps, the movie eras. We'll see what happens. But they have promised to sort of do, here's your main characters and here's some weirdos. And seemingly it sounds like they've got quite a few, sculpts. They certainly have a lot more characters planned. And I think a lot of confidence sort of, pushing behind this. So I'm really excited to see what they do. Time of recording, we're just past San Diego Comic-Con. We'll see what comes at New York Comic-Con in the fall, but they did show at least the very first original series figure, that being Uhura, and she looks fantastic, and I am so excited to get into this line. I don't have one yet, so cannot comment. But by and large, I mean, if I have a few Nacelle figures, and they're great, they're fun. Go look it up. And frankly, I mean, this is probably it. I mean, there's so many lines that sort of come and go, but this seems like there's at least, some backing to it. So I would suspect to see Counselor Troi, Dr. Crusher. There is a Dr. Crusher already confirmed in, let's say, one of the more weirder episodes of the series. But also, Guinan, Ensign Ro Laren, Sela, Lursa and Baitor, like you name it. Like I'm pretty, I can say with pretty good confidence, we will see a lot more from Nacelle in the future. I promised I wouldn't ramble. Anyway, here we are. Thank you for watching. Thank you for liking, subscribing, commenting, and all those YouTubey things. And I will see you next time on MIA 80s Ladies.